Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing incredibly well and that you're relaxed and ready to get yourself a lovely hot cup of cocoa, because I've got a lovely story for you tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I live directly opposite a house that is rumoured to be haunted. It doesn't bother me all that much, although in the very beginning I felt somewhat reticent about moving into this house, as it overlooked something as unsettling and outer-worldly as the Shannon house. By all accounts, on a very overcast day, when the sky is a gunmetal grey colour, with a threat of rain hanging in the air, the dingy, tenebrific atmosphere that hangs over the Shannon house is like a dark, ominous, foggy curtain, which can be extremely menacing at the best of times. If I stare out of my large bay windows of my living room, even for a brief moment, that most unfortunately overlook the facade of the Shannon house, with its morbidly grey exterior, where burgeoning vines rambunctiously climb up the walls, while the dark, vacuously empty windows stare back at me so soullessly. This foreboding house seems to be, dare I say it, but the Shannon house appears to be permanently caught under a grim halo. But on stormy days such as this, where there is an inauspicious, moody sky, it only serves to exacerbate how seriously sinister the place really is. On occasions like this, I will draw my curtains to block out the less than auspicious view. For some reason, I always have a sense that I am being watched, as if the Shannon house is in some way alive, and yet dead at the very same time, if that makes any sense at all. The place seems to remind me of a woman wearing sackcloth and ashes, who is mourning the loss of her husband when he never returned home from a long sea voyage, for he was probably drowned at sea, or maybe his ship hit a rock and sunk. And such is the grief of this poor woman that she boldly wears her lugubrious melancholia on her person, that is so tangible you can actually feel it. And nothing says keep away more than an aggressively forsaken energy such as this. This is why on most days of the week I have wisely conditioned myself to avoid looking at the Shannon house, if I can possibly help it. But it's not always that easy to accomplish such a goal. Sometimes in an unguarded moment I can't help myself but briefly steal a glance at the property, and when I do, I almost always regret it, because I will stare at the house for longer than I should, and an electric prickle of great trepidation overcomes me, and it is so profound I can actually feel the bitter taste of gall consume the back of my throat, and there have been times that I have rushed to the ladies' room to throw out the contents of my stomach. I've never known a house to have such a profound, powerful effect like this over my emotions. Unfortunately, something that is staring at you in the face morning, noon and night, at the very best of times, is difficult to ignore, unless of course you pull the curtains permanently. I don't like to do that, as I love to allow the pretty beams of sparkling sunlight into the house to brighten up my home. I don't fancy living permanently in the darkness just to block out the views from the house opposite. Sometimes the best thing to do is to pretend the Shannon house isn't even there, and that it doesn't even exist. But that's just wishful thinking on my part. I never believed in ghosts until I moved into a house that overlooks the town's reputably most haunted house. But after I moved here, I can hand on heart honestly say, I have become much more open-minded to the idea of ghostly phenomena, when such thoughts in my past when I was a city girl would have seemed all but preposterously insane, but not so much any more. I fortunately acquired my current property at an absolute steal. I am told the previous owners that had lived here for 30 years were advised to drop the price of my home substantially and sell it for a fraction of what it was really worth, so they got a raw deal, simply because their property overlooked a house with a haunted reputation. Some people won't buy a house that has an unsightly view, or overlooks a cemetery or a haunted house. But when you are limited, well, on a limited budget, so to speak, many people desiring to have a home that they can call their own simply don't have the luxury of choice,
So sometimes you have to settle for the best deal, which you can possibly get, which is what I invariably did. Of course, I was forced to do a whole lot of soul-searching, but in the end I knew I would never find such an amazing house, in such an idyllic location, for so little money, and the alternative of living in a dingy matchbox-size apartment held no appeal to me whatsoever. I reasoned with myself that living opposite a haunted house couldn't be all that bad. I was from the city of Atlanta, and unlike the superstitious people living here in this small, rather charming rural town in the Pacific Northwest, I was not given into the idle fancies that some of the townsfolk literally indulge themselves in, where they would allow superstitions to cloud their judgment and dictate some of their choices. I'm pretty sure folk around here would never be seen dead walking under a ladder. If the truth be told, I was not best pleased to purchase a home that overlooked a house with a very disquieting, haunted reputation. And even though I believed the ruminations about the place were just fictitious hogwash, I could not deny to myself that the first time I'd laid eyes on the Shannon house, the place was so incredibly foreboding that it seemed to crawl under my skin like an infestation of maggots. I knew that with one glance at the Shannon house, something bad had happened there, and it was after sensing this, I am now utterly convinced that the houses that we reside in are like living sea sponges that soak up the energy of anything negative that may have happened in a place, almost like an invisible recording that keeps being replayed back in our time. It's almost as if the devastating traumatic event that must have happened there had become part of the house, like a signature in a legal document. An energy like this is not easily extinguished with the appointment of a bottle of bleach, a coat of paint, scented candles perhaps, or fragrant bouquets, as the energy has unabashedly seeped into the very fabric of the house, like a port wine stain on a wooden table that soaks right into the wood, and the only way to remove it is with a sandblaster, and even that is not guaranteed. There is something offensively creepy and uncomfortably dispiriting about the Shannon house that leaves people around this town very much on edge. And if you mention ghostly things, the locals in town will always talk about the Shannon house. I have personally witnessed firsthand how the locals in this small town always cross the opposite side of the road when they walk past the Shannon house. They will dip their chins to the pavement, increase their walking pace exponentially, and refuse to look at the house, almost as if some way, just by laying their eyes on the place, it might contaminate them with its cloying, dark, oppressive energy that the house so obviously exudes. I do know the immediate next-door neighbours, living on both sides of the Shannon house, literally keep their blinds permanently drawn. I, on the other hand, am not so lucky. I came to this small town to lay down roots, as in my own way I was running away from my old life in Atlanta, from my helicopter overbearing mother, who completely dominated my entire life and intruded so much in my personal space that sometimes I really felt like a bug in a jam jar, with holes punched in the top of the jar, that was being watched all the time, and unable to live my life independently. Then there was a relationship I'd had with a man called Warren Peterson, which went on for 8 long-suffering, laborious years. My mother was practically begging me to marry Warren. I realized that the two of us had absolutely nothing in common, and so in a moment of absolute boldness I ended our relationship, which was the best thing I ever did. My breakup with Warren Peterson only served to upset my mother, who described me as being ungrateful and selfish and not realizing I had a good thing when it was staring me blindingly in the face. "You're an absolute fool, Miranda," she told me. "An absolute fool. Any girl would be completely grateful to marry a man of Warren Peterson's substance and caliber. But no, you look a gift horse in the mouth, don't you? And you walk away. I'm so dreadfully disappointed in you, my girl. There really are no words. I had such high hopes for your relationship with Warren. You were so good for each other. The two of you had so much in common. But now you've blown it. The poor man is absolutely devastated that you broke up with him. He'd have given you the world, you know, and more besides if I know him. But no, you're too much of a fool to actually see it. That's what happens when you're grossly naive. Wait until you get a little older, love. You'll realise what you lost. And don't you dare come crying to me over the spilt milk that you dropped." "Mum," I retorted, "I don't love Warren. I never did. We didn't have anything in common. I don't know where you get that idea from. I did the right thing breaking up with him. It was the kindest thing to do. The only reason I stayed with him for so long is because you were piling on the pressure for us to be together. You believed he was so great for me, and I wanted to believe you were right about him. But honestly, we never connected."
"How dare you, Miranda, suggest I was putting pressure on you to date Warren Peterson? Nothing could be further from the truth. I may remind you that you were the one that told me when you brought Warren home to meet me and your father, that you yourself thought you'd found the one. I was deeply cynical at the time, but Warren Peterson grew on me fast, and I realized you really had found a trooper in him. And now you just spit him out like an old piece of chewing gum, as if he means nothing to you."
"You know why you liked him so much, Mum?" I snorted. "It was because he was malleable in your hands. You've always been able to tell Warren what to do, and he listens to you. God forbid if I brought a man home who stood up to you. You'd probably have a seizure on the spot and immediately write him off as the most dreadful person you've ever had the misfortune to meet. I know what you're like, Mum, all too well." My mother snorted at me in disgust.
"Look at the spiteful venom coming out of your mouth, Miranda. It really is like that of a deadly viper, if you don't mind my saying so. It's most unbecoming for a girl as pretty as yourself. Nothing you say is remotely true. I happen to like Warren Peterson because he was good for you, and you made a delightful couple together. I think you're really going to regret ending things with him."
"I seriously doubt it, Mum," I said, making a face. To all intents and purposes, I certainly figured out that leaving Atlanta would help me escape my mother's toxicity. She'd really dragged me down over the years and inadvertently stolen my freedom, so I was rather like a bird in a gilded cage with clipped wings that so longed to fly away. But I couldn't because of my obvious impediments. I knew getting away from my mother and Warren Peterson was in my best interests. When I told my mother I was moving away from Atlanta, it really was the hardest thing I'd ever done in my entire life. Telling her something I knew would more than just ruffle her feathers. Ostensibly, she was absolutely livid with me for having the gumption to leave my childhood home. Let's just say I packed up all my worldly goods in the trunk of my gold SUV that didn't amount to terribly much, and I set off on a road trip to find for myself a very small town in the Pacific Northwest where I could settle down to a brand new life. And based on my research, I had a good idea as to where that would be. I knew my new life needed to be far enough away from my mother to give me the space I needed, and to at long last acquire the independence I ravenously craved. It was my grandmother, Violet Irwin, who was my mother's mother, who was the one that gave me enough money to enjoy this new start in life. She understood how suffocated I felt under my mother's draconian reign. Granny Violet was the one that encouraged me to move away from Atlanta, to begin a new life far away from home. And at first I was somewhat reluctant to embrace her generous gift, almost as if someone was asking me to jump off a steep cliff into a deep body of dark water. And I was not completely sure whether I'd sink or swim.
"It's not terribly much, love," Granny Violet said to me almost apologetically, handing me a sizable cheque.
"What's this for, Granny Violet?" I asked, reading the cheque that she had given me, with a mouth that was so wide I looked as if I was trying to catch flies. I looked up at my grandmother soberly and said, "I can't possibly accept this kind of money from you, Granny Violet. It's generous of you to give me so much money, and I appreciate your magnanimous gesture. But I'm sure you need the money much more than I do." I tried to hand my grandmother back her cheque, but she insistently pushed my hand away and refused to accept it.
"I can assure you, Miranda dear, I wouldn't give you a cheque if I couldn't afford to give it to you," she told me, closing my hands around the cheque so that it crumpled in my palms.
"But why, Granny Violet? I don't understand," I said, looking confounded. What is the purpose of you giving me so much money? It makes no sense. What have I done to deserve all of this? My grandmother looked at me through grey blue eyes.
You're my granddaughter. Of course you deserve it, dear. You don't know why I'm giving you this money. Do you really mean that when you say it? Do I need to spell it out to you? I would have thought my motivations to giving you this money were obvious.
They're not to me, Granny Violet. I'm cluelessly dumb, I admitted. You're going to have to spell out the obvious to me, I'm afraid. My grandmother sighed, as if she couldn't believe I was being so blind-sighted.
I've given you the cheque, Miranda, because I believe you need to get away from Atlanta to begin a brand new life for yourself. This money should give you some financial freedom so that you can move away and experience the luxury of what it feels like to be fully independent, without your mother completely dominating your entire life. Your mother's like a sea creature that has set up residence in your shell, pushing you out all the time. Don't get me wrong, Miranda, dear. I love your mother very much indeed. She is my daughter. But even I have to admit that she's insufferable at the very best of times. And when I say that, that's me being kind. There are other words I would use to describe your mother that are less congenial, so I shan't entertain them. Let's just say your well-meaning mother has mollycoddled, bullied and controlled you all of her life, from the moment you first drew breath, and's been something for me that has been painful to watch over the years. Very painful indeed, she said, shaking her head sadly.
That's true, I admitted. My mother has always controlled me. I'm not stupid, Granny Violet. I know exactly what she's like.
There you go, then, said Grandma Violet. I think you know where I'm going with this, Miranda, dear. Your mother has an aggressively dominating personality. She's been like this all her life. She simply takes over everything she touches. Do you know the fete they had at the church last weekend? Well, your mother took over the organizer, took charge of absolutely everything, pushed the woman out. She likes to handle everything herself in her own way and doesn't realize what she's doing to other people. It's very offensive to many of them.
I know. I heard about that, I said, hanging my head sadly. Mum just can't help herself.
I'm sure she means well, love, said Granny Violet. But your mother fails to understand that people need to live their own lives to make their own decisions for themselves, without her rudely butting in and taking over everything, and telling everyone how and what to do, as if it's her indomitable right. Believe me, when she was growing up as a little girl, she tried to control me back then, and I was her mother, for goodness sake.
You're kidding. She was bossing you around as a child, Granny Violet.
You bet she was, dear. When your mother was only 8 years old, she was telling me exactly what I needed to do. And guess what? I was doing everything she asked of me, without even realize I was being bullied, until one day it dawned on me that my little girl was actually controlling me. That revelation hit me hard like a baseball bat across the head.
I had no idea she was like that, Granny Violet. You never said.
Well, you don't talk about that kind of thing, do you? But anyway, let's just say your mother has always been masterfully manipulative. Very subtle about it, though. And that is why you don't even know it's happening. I know it sounds insane, but that woman really gets under your skin, and not always in a good way. I know what she's like. She's only got significantly worse over the years, I hasten to say. She's impossible. How your poor father puts up with the likes of her, I honestly don't know. When your father first got together with your mother, I joked to him. I said, I hope you know what you're getting into with my daughter. I'm not sure he actually did. I thought your father was such a good man, who deserved a whole lot better than my own daughter. But he stuck with her. When you were born, I knew how committed your father was into staying in the marriage and making things work, because he had a responsibility in taking care of you, and he was determined to do that. Now I see your mother completely controlling your father, like a vine that strangles a building until it can breathe no longer. And that's what she's done to all of us, myself included. And she's slowly but surely doing it to you."
"That's a good way to put it, Granny Violet," I admitted. "I do feel sorry for Dad being under Mother's thumb all the time. There were times growing up I hoped he'd divorce her, but he never did. Mummy's such a bully, and I don't think she realizes she is. She's always telling Dad what to do. Sometimes he looks so sad, rather like a tiger in a cage that is dying to escape, but quite frankly hasn't got the guts to do it. But he would if he could. My guess is he's stuck between a rock and a hard place."
"Well, you've put it very eloquently, dear. That's exactly what I tend to think," said Granny Violet. "Your father would probably have loved to have left your mother a long time ago, but he was so dedicated to taking care of you and being a good father to you. And now, with all these years that have gone past, I don't think he'd know what to do with himself now. It's like he's got so used to the status quo, hasn't he?"
"I suppose you're right. Besides, if he was to leave my mother, she wouldn't allow another woman to get their claws into Dad. She'd stalk them until they were just so afraid of her that they'd leave him well alone."
"Sounds exactly what your mother would do." "You echo my sentiments exactly, dear. But I rather feel like your father, that you're heading down the same path, where you're completely under your mother's formidable control. And I don't want to see that happening to you."
"What do you mean, Granny Violet?" I asked, bracing myself for some uncomfortable truths that I knew I was about to hear. Granny Violet again shook her head sadly.
"I hate to be blatantly obvious, Miranda, but you are like a beautiful flower, growing in a flower bed that is being strangled to high heaven by all the weeds that are taking over that bed, so that the stunning, beautiful flower very slowly starts to become suffocated. It's no longer able to breathe, and slowly but surely begins to fade. The beautiful colour is the first to go, and then everything else descends into oblivion, until the beautiful flower is remembered no more, and all that is left is a burgeoning bed of unsightly weeds."
"You really think I'm like that, Granny Violet?" I asked, looking quite affronted that my grandmother viewed me in such a dismal light. I knew what she was saying was that, much like my father, my mother was such a dominating personality that she was practically squeezing the life out of me. And much as I hated to admit this, deep down in my gut, I knew that Granny Violet spoke the truth. Even as a child at school, my friends were always afraid of my mother, as were the teachers, because my mother used to take over absolutely everything.
"Yes, I do, love," Grandma Violet said to me. "I hate to say this, but I'm seeing your mother's dominating personality suck you dry like a blood-sucking leech. Look at you. You're 25 years old, for goodness sake, with your whole life ahead of you, and you're still living under your mother's thumb. She even insisted that that boyfriend of yours moved into the house with you, and was trying to push the two of you to get married, when anybody could see you were completely wrong for each other. I was very proud of you, love, for having the courage to end that relationship, even though it really upset your mother that you did so. There was no doubt in my mind she wanted to control you and your relationship like she controls everything in your life. I could see how utterly miserable you were becoming. And things are only going to get a whole lot worse for you the longer you live under that woman's roof. She dictates everything you do, Miranda, and if you continue to live with her, your life will never ever be your own. Surely you must realize that."
I shrugged my shoulders together and nodded my head. "It's true. She has taken over my life." A tear slipped down my cheek, which even took me by surprise, for I hadn't expected that. My voice trembled, dropping to a whisper, as I held Grandma Violet's gaze. "Sometimes," I said, my words becoming all wobbly. Sometimes I feel as if I can't breathe."
"Well, I'm very glad you finally admit it, love," said Granny Violet. "That's a promising start. Now don't you dare cry, love, We're fixing the problem together, aren't we? The way I see it is that admitting you have a problem in the first place is going a long way to solving it. I can read your mother like a book, Miranda, but I'm sure you already know that by now. When you've lived with someone for long enough, you figure out pretty quickly what makes them tick.
It's true, Granny Violet. Mum's never been able to pull the wool over your eyes. You've always had her figured out. Which is probably why your relationship with her, well, it's a little tense, isn't it?
You can say that again, said my grandmother with a heavy, exasperated sigh. Let's just say your mother's always been terribly transparent to me. She hates that I know what's going on in that mind of hers. I'll tell you this, the only reason she wanted you to marry the likes of Warren Peterson was because she knew she could control him. So he would do her every bidding. In the end, the two of you would end up living under her roof for the rest of your lives. Your mother would persuade you to do so. You know what she's like. And then she would be controlling her grandchildren as well. It's all part of her duplicitous plan, so to speak. Of course, she probably has no idea how conniving she actually is, because someone like that fails to see what they're really like. They think when they exercise dominance that they're showing love. If your mother had her way, you would live under her roof for the rest of your days, Miranda dear, and never leave home a single day of your life. And that's pathetic any way you look at it. A girl your age should not be living with her mother and father any more, unless, of course, circumstances dictate otherwise. There are some unfortunate young people who stay at home indefinitely, not through any choice of their own, but because they simply cannot afford to invest in the property market or rent a suitable place, so they end up staying with their parents. But you have a chance, Miranda, to move away from home for good. And you need to grab it with both hands. You'll never get another golden opportunity like this, let me tell you.
I reflected very soberly on Granny Violet's words, and I knew she spoke the absolute truth. My mother really wanted me to live under her roof forever, probably with Warren Peterson at my side, along with a herd of grandchildren, that my mother would delight in ordering around, all the while deluding herself into believing that she was being unconditionally loving towards us all. We wouldn't even realize what she was doing to us. We would become like senseless insects that had been indiscriminately caught up in my mother's silken web, where she'd be feasting on us alive like an ongoing banquet that would never end, and we wouldn't even know that we were being surreptitiously eaten. You're right, Granny Violet, I admitted. Mum would like me to live with her forever, and I don't want that. I really don't. My grandmother grabbed my arm and gave it an affectionate squeeze.
Of course you don't want to live the rest of your life with your parents. I mean, that's perfectly understandable. Any young woman would feel exactly the same way as you do. But that is what ultimately will happen if you don't take the bull by the horns. And that means being courageous, Miranda. Things aren't always straightforward, nor are they easy, but sometimes we have to do what we have to do. I know you love your mother very much, and you're terrified of hurting her feelings and causing her offence. But when, you have to ask yourself this, Miranda, has she been concerned about hurting your feelings?
She doesn't care about hurting my feelings, I admitted. She doesn't really care about my feelings. She only cares about her own feelings.
Well, there you go again. I make my point very clear, don't I? What I want you to do is I want you to look at your life very dispassionately through a lens. Look at yourself as if you're viewing a stranger and her life. And ask yourself, after viewing your life through a stranger's eyes, what advice you would give that stranger if you were wearing her shoes. Think about it like that for a second.
Well, I would tell her to get the hell away from her mother and to start living her authentic life without her mother always butting in.
Well, there you go, dear. You've answered your own question. You know exactly what you need to do.
But you know what, Granny Violet?
What is it, dear?
I'm just worried. I'm just worried that I don't have the guts to do anything. I'm afraid of leaving Mum. I'm afraid of being on my own. I'm afraid of being independent.
I'm fearful of almost everything. But of course, dear, you need to understand that that is how you will invariably feel, for you haven't had much life experience, have you? But you also need your space, and that is important. Your mother wants you to naively believe that you can't manage without her, that you're dependent on her for your every need. But none of that is remotely true, and you must realize that, surely. You need your independence, Miranda. I can't stress that enough. Look how fearful you are, Miranda. That's not natural for a woman of your young age. Most young people want to reach for the stars. They've got exciting plans for their future. But you are reluctant to step forward into the world of the unknown, which is exactly what you need to do. For your own good, you need to move away from Atlanta. I've got faith in you that you can make a brand new start for yourself, Miranda. And take it from me, it'll be the best, wisest, most sensible decision that you ever made. And one day you'll thank me for persuading you to leave. As in moving away, you will find yourself. But I'm not sure I can do it, Granny Violet. I know you must think I'm such a wuss, and I probably am. But it scares me half to death to move away from everything that I've known. I'm terrified as well about how Mum will react when I tell her I'm leaving. She'll likely think World War III has erupted or something. I'm also afraid of beginning again. I haven't got your kind of courage, Granny Violet. Nonsense, child. You are talking nonsense. You've got a great deal of courage. Only you don't know it yet. Don't you see what your mother has done to you? Over these years, in monopolizing every single aspect of your life, she wants you to believe that without her, you are nothing, which is far from the truth. My guess is without her, you will flourish like a tree in spring that suddenly bursts into blossom. You're just going to open up, and you're just going to find yourself, Miranda, and that's very, very exciting. Your mother is going to be rather begrudging when she realizes you want to move away. But you need to do so, love. It's in your best interests. And even though at first you might be reluctant to dive into the deep end, I know when you do, you will swim and not drown. You're a survivor, Miranda. I've always known that about you.
You really think I'm a survivor, Granny Violet? I asked gingerly, doubting that I had any kind of survival instinct, because my mother throughout my life had taken ownership of everything, like artificial intelligence taking over a human brain, in a manner of speaking.
Of course you're a survivor, Miranda, my dear. Don't you dare doubt that for a single second. Unfortunately, we both know your mother has always controlled the reins of your life. But that is about to change. Well, if I have anything to do with it. But you need to break free from her formidable clutches, love. I'm an old woman. I'm not getting much younger. But advancing age has two intrinsic benefits. It makes you wise and discerning. So I know what I'm talking about. And if I've learnt anything in my long life, that is that everybody needs to have their own space. It's terribly, terribly important, you know. And to be the person that God ordained them to be. And that will never happen for you under your mother's hawk-like watch. Not when she controls every aspect of your life, rather like a puppet on a string.
I knew Granny Violet spoke the truth. There was an unbridled part of myself that really wanted to break free from my mother's doggedly resistant clutches, rather like a wild stallion that has been cooped up in a stable for far too long, and is desirous to bring the stable door crashing down with its powerful hooves, just to get away, as it knows the green wild pastures are so much better than the four walls of the stall that shut it away from the world. I was like that stallion. I wanted to be free. So there we are. That is the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.